I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to be discussing the aftermath of the French and Indian War, the massive global conflict that rewrote the map of North America, and so today we're going to look at the aftermath here. So, here are our objectives. Take a moment to absorb and take them in, as you'll be having to write responses to them at the end of class. And let's dive into our story. So as we talked about previously, the Peace of Paris led to a redrawing of the map. As you can see here, the French colony of Louisiana and New France are no more, having been absorbed by a combination of the British and the Spanish. The British were able to drive the French out and ostensibly take over all of French territory. But as we talked about last time, this taking over of French territory didn't really take into consideration the Native Americans, who at this point were spectacularly not pacified. There was some battles against the Cherokee in the south, but especially in the Ohio River Valley, the area that the war was ostensibly about, there were still some just slight issues there. As a Chippewa chief noted, quote, "Englishmen, although you have conquered the French, you have not yet conquered us. We are not your slaves." So, the Native Americans, for the most part, wanted to return to the status quo in which fur trade was happening. They were getting access to European finished goods, and there was limited European settlement within their territory. Every time the British had tried to encroach upon this territory, whether it was our friend General George Washington or British General Braddock, or in the aftermath, a general named Amherst launched a sort of expeditionary force into the Ohio River Valley, the result was the same, and the Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley proved both that, one, Europeans and colonists had no idea how to actually fight in the sort of heavily wooded territory of the Ohio, and two, the Native Americans were spectacularly effective fighters. This organized Native American resistance became known as Pontiac's War because it was led by an Ottawa chief by the name of Pontiac, who we see here pictured to the left. He created a sort of Native American alliance with the goal being drive the Europeans out, defeat any expeditionary force they had, and continue to reinforce Native American dominance within the Ohio River Valley. Of this, he was incredibly effective, using a combination of political acumen and also religious connections to draw comparisons between different Native American groups. Quote, "This land where you live I have made for you and not for others. How comes it that you suffer the whites upon your land? Can you not do without them? I know those whom you call the children of your great father supply your wants, but if you were not bad as you are, you would do well without them. You might live wholly as you did before you knew them. Before those who you call brothers come to your lands, did you not live by bow and arrow? You had no need of gun, nor powder, nor the rest of their things. And nevertheless you caught animals to live on and clothed yourself in your skins. But when I saw that you were inclined to the evil, I called back the animals of the depth of the woods, so that you had need of your brothers to have your wants supplied, and I shall send back to you animals to live on." End quote. And so you can see Pontiac here is using some religious iconography to try to argue that the Native Americans were better off without Europeans, and that they could go back to their old way of life if they could drive the Europeans out. Quote, "Send them back to the country which I made for them, there let them remain." Pontiac's War was a massive war in which this Native American coalition attacked and burned a number of British forts. You can see all the ones on fire there. Also attacked most of the other forts in the area. And there were very few British forts that were not assaulted, and most of them, or a significant number of them, were destroyed. My favorite is Fort Michilimackinac, pronounced incorrectly, obviously, in northern what is today Michigan, where the Native Americans, in order to take the fort, had staged an impromptu lacrosse game outside the fort. Lacrosse was a traditional Native American sport. The British came out to watch. The Native Americans had this massive lacrosse game, and then at one point the lacrosse ball flew into the fort. The Native Americans ran in to get it, then seized a bunch of weapons, killed the British, and took the fort. The British, the British's probably worst tactic, was at Fort Pitt, what used to be Fort Duquesne. They took blankets that had been used on smallpox patients and gave them to the Native Americans to attempt to start an epidemic. But fortunately for the Native Americans, smallpox had already gone through, and they were very good at quarantining people who got it, and so they were able to effectively blunt this British attempt at germ warfare. The other problem the British had is that the 7 Years' War significantly increased the debt of the British Empire. The British Empire had already been in debt from a variety of different kind of ill-conceived military adventures and all the mercantilists and wars of European succession. But the 7 Years' War led them to significantly increase their debt based on their strategy of shipping their army across the ocean. In the aftermath of the war, they passed what's called the Quartering Act to try to get the colonists to pay for the quartering of soldiers, but this was very unpopular, and the colonists attempted to dodge it whenever possible. The British also had tons of troops in the Americas, but again, they were not able to effectively fight in the Ohio River Valley, and the British weren't able to pay these troops, nor were they able to effectively send them home, and the colonists were resisting paying for them. And so sending a huge expeditionary force to try to put down Pontiac and his extremely capable forces was kind of out of the question because they didn't have the money to do it, even if they knew how, which they 100% did not. So the British ended up signing a peace treaty with Pontiac, basically giving in and saying, all right, we're not going to encroach on your territory anymore. You've won. We're backing off. As a result of this, they passed what's called the Proclamation, where, quote, wherever such frauds and abuses have been committed in purchasing land to the Indians, to the great prejudice of our interests and to the great dissatisfaction of said Indians, therefore, in order to prevent such irregularities in the future, and to the end that the Indians may be convinced of our justice and determined resolution to remove all the reasonable causes of discontent, we do strictly enjoin and require that no person do presume to make any purchase from any said Indians of any lands reserved for said Indians within those parts of our colonies where we have thought proper to allow settlement. So, this leads to the creation of the quote-unquote Proclamation Line. You can see it here on the map. It looks almost as if they drew it right along the Appalachian Mountains and almost as if it was to establish the borders of the British colonies prior to the French and Indian War, and said that there's going to be no British settlement west of this line. This is problematic for a whole bunch of different reasons, namely because, one, there were already a bunch of colonists living west of this line. Two, the British already are having problems with enforcement, and so how are they logistically going to keep people out? And three, the whole purpose of this war was to get the territory that is now being reserved for Native Americans for British settlement. And so the colonists fortunately have a strategy to deal with British laws that they don't like, and that's totally ignore them. And so that's what happened in this case. The colonists totally ignored the Proclamation Line, continued settling, absolutely ignoring the British, and conflict with Native Americans would continue. This led to awkward confrontations like the Paxton Boys Revolt. The Paxton Boys were a group of Scotch-Irish settlers in western Pennsylvania, west of the Proclamation Line. They were having conflicts with Native Americans, similar to Bacon's Rebellion. They then took it onto themselves to go and massacre a group of Native Americans who they were not having conflict with and who had assimilated and created a European-style town, the town of Conestoga. They killed all the men, women, and children there. They were then declared outlaws by none other than the government of Philadelphia and Benjamin Franklin, who described them as, quote, barbarous men who committed an atrocious act, and that, quote, the blood of the innocent will cry to the heaven for vengeance. So Dr. Franklin's not pulling any punches here. And then the Paxton Boys argued that, quote, they sent several petitions to the governor and assembly, which is supposed to have concealed by some ill-designing persons, and that the government never received these remonstrances, and yet the distressed people believed that they had and looked upon themselves as, quote, utterly neglected and their sufferings despised by the government. So they formed an army, marched on Philadelphia, and in the end, Dr. Franklin came up with a solution. He was able to negotiate the Paxton Boys' head back, and in response, he offered a bounty on each Native American killed. And so the colonists could now kill Native Americans at will and get paid for it. And so it's kind of a crowdsourcing dealing of the Native American problem, and a great solution for everyone who's not the Native Americans, and more or less ensuring that warfare along the frontier would continue. All of this led to the creation of much larger local militias. The regulator movement continued to spread as people in the western areas started training and creating their militias. Although none of the regulators were actually successful in overthrowing colonial governments, it did lead to the colonists becoming much more organized and much better armed, which is going to become relevant here in about 2 lessons. And This is the situation in the aftermath. Now you've got colonists heavily armed, defending themselves on the frontier against Native Americans, resentful of the government, which argues that the Proclamation Line means that they don't have to defend them. You've got Native Americans very upset about continued encroachment on their territory. You've got British colonial laws being utterly neglected. And you've got a situation that does not solve any of the problems that it was supposed to solve, paving the way for significant future conflict. And not to mention, England is absolutely broke and has no ability to pay for the enforcement of any of these laws. So, we'll pick the story up here tomorrow. Thank you for listening.